And I probably shouldn't have discussed that because it's a little more advanced. Okay, the next thing that he talks about is that Lincoln returns to this idea of, and I erased it, this idea of assimilation, right? He returns to this idea of assimilation, right? So what ends up happening is that assimilation is coded in this sense of what's known as opportunity, right? There's an opportunity. So for example, Norwegians during the Second World War had the opportunity, right? The opportunity to become Germans, right? Obviously there is this intent to increase and expand the Germanization of Norwegians, right? So that Nazi Germany wanted to Germanize Norwegians, right? There's a lot that we have in common. You can be brothers like we are. You can dig deep and understand your German ancestry. If you conform to the National Socialist Party, then you too can be German, right? So there's this assimilation, this process of assimilation. Obviously, this opportunity, right? This opportunity is cloaked in a very real sort of threat. There really isn't an opportunity, right? An opportunity assumes that you can do otherwise. That I might not want to be a German. Right? I'll just remain a Norwegian. And Lemkin goes through fabulous accounts of how banks were targeted, how funds were diverted, and we'll talk about a lot of this in a second. If you wanted to practice painting, if you wanted to be an artist, they were only reserved, the licenses were only reserved for Germans and so on and so forth. So people recognize that there really isn't an opportunity. I have to become German since my occupiers are German, and if I refuse to be German and I remain a Norwegian, then I'm not going to have the same advantages as everyone else will. Right? It might not be the case that I'm exterminated as the Jews are, but I definitely will not have the same advantages that others have that choose to assimilate, right? So in a sense, this assimilation is forced, right? The way that it's coded, the way that it's cloaked, is in this idea of an opportunity to become German, or to become, it doesn't necessarily have to be German. The example that I'm using now pertains to World War II, but obviously it can be the opportunity to be the social group of the oppressor, right? This opportunity is nothing more than the second phase of Lemkin's account of genocide, right? It is the imposition of the national pattern on the oppressed group, right? If the oppressed group are Norwegians and the national pattern is the Germanization of Norwegians, then obviously Norwegians only have one possibility, to become German, right? Anything else is just going to reduce their benefits, and most people will select to assimilate, and this assimilation is obviously forced, right? Okay. So what we recognize then in this account is, according to Lemkin, it's really not as simple as you think it would, right? This is a little bit, and to be honest, this is a little bit more than an introductory. But given the fact that it's a public discussion, I think there's a clear account. So let me just clarify it a little bit, right? Two things. Lemkin is claiming, one, that anytime we're talking about genocide, we are specifically talking about, in some sense, in some area, in some way, the imposition and the destruction of a national group and their patterns of identity, and sort of the imposition of my own patterns of identity. Once I've done that, once I've imposed myself, once I'm there, once I've occupied everything, now it's sort of like the maintenance, the daily maintenance of things. And I ask myself, okay, the national pattern that I am now occupying, if it's in, let's say, Poland, well, we're not going to allow Poles to assimilate, right? So what are we going to do? We're going to, specifically, they're going to start exploiting Polish residents. They're going to push them off their land. They're going to introduce German occupants, give them tax incentives and breaks to live in Poland, and so on and so forth. So assimilation is not an option, right? All the Polish Jews will be exterminated. So that's sort of the imposition of my national pattern. But that imposition of the national pattern it's incorrect to say that it only manifests in terms of extermination. Lemkin is not explicit about this, but he also says that there's an imposition of this national pattern that is not as hostile, right? It's not as hostile. There's an imposition of the national pattern for those that I wouldn't mind assimilating, right? They're sort of like me. We share roughly the same language. We share roughly the same culture. We share roughly the same social institutions. So, for example, Norway, right? So Germany gives Norwegians the opportunity, right? You now, Norwegians, have the opportunity to assimilate and become like Germans. However, if you choose not to assimilate, here's everything that you'll be denied. So, isn't it much better just to assimilate and become Germans? And most people say yes. So that you have an imposition of national patterns in occupied territories. You have an imposition of a national pattern that is extremely hostile. It results in occupying other people's property, forcing them off their land, exterminating human beings, biological destruction of human groups, and so on and so on and so on. You have another form of imposition of national pattern of the oppressor that isn't as hostile, and basically this arises in this notion of enforced, what I would call like enforced assimilation, right? He doesn't use this term, I use this term, but I'd call it enforced assimilation, right? It's an assimilation that's enforced and is coded in this opportunity. That's basically what Lemkin is saying. Okay,